George Walton Jr., I'd like to go back, Walton County being named. I really feel that Walton County was probably not named for George Walton Jr., but instead for his father, the signer of the Declaration of Independence, George Walton, the signer. He had died in 1804 and had not come with the family to Florida in 1821 when George Walton Jr. was appointed Secretary of State for the Territory of Florida, in West Florida and then Florida. But his mother did move with him in 1821, and she did not die until 1832. She and her son, George Walton, owned thousands of acres in Leon County and Jefferson County. They're very, you can get copies of all those land grants. But George Walton Jr., as handsome as he is, and at first people like Henry Marie Brackenridge, who was the first judge of West Florida, had his courthouse in Alaqua. He did not like George at all. He had some real trouble, and George liked to shoot pool and do some other things. And then particularly he got into some, and it's documented within the state because they came after him finally maybe cleared him, but he got in trouble for not paying his rent or fees, and so he was in all kinds of trouble. So I can't imagine, even though he was within the system, that he would have named it after himself when the very next year, 1825, Washington County was named after President George Washington, who had been a friend of his father's in the American Revolution. They had fought together. And then you had other counties named after, sometimes contemporaries, like Duval had his name, but he wasn't in trouble. It's well documented, the trouble that George Walton Jr. was in. So I believe that we need to probably go to the National Archives because the state archives is unclear on that. So that's some further research that needs to be done there. But Henry Marie Brackenridge did come around to making amends with George Walton. In fact, he was the tutor of George Walton's brilliant daughter, Madame Octavia Walton Levert. And he only spoke to her in Spanish. And so they lived in Pensacola, but then he had vast land there where the Naval Live Oak is now. Brackenridge owned on the peninsula there, lots of acres, and he was the one that encouraged the development and the use of oak trees, because at that time, oak trees were used to build Navy ships. So that was really important to the emerging American in Florida. So then I have Octavia, a picture of her over there, and I have her dress. I portray her. The Beauvays made the dress for me. There's a picture of Octavia is hanging in the archives in Montgomery. And so my mother, Gloria Anderson Hollingsworth, and her husband, Sonny Hollingsworth, went up there and took this picture for me. And then I had the dress made by the Beauvays, and they made it, and they made a lot of the Chautauqua dresses for Diane Pickett, all the ones that she wears. And so they were just meticulous in making a replica of this dress. And what Octavia wore this for was to save the Save Mount Vernon Society, because see, her grandfather Walton had been good friends with President Washington, and Octavia was an important person in American history, and she was part of that society that was raising money to save Mount Vernon. And President Abraham Lincoln, I believe, was a gentleman advisor. So we had, Octavia wrote a book, and in 1857, she took 2 trips to Europe, and she was friends with all the famous people of the day. Washington Irving was a great friend of hers. They met in 1833. Octavia was living in Pensacola with her brother, and they were on a stagecoach, and they were going to Washington, D.C. and so forth for her debut trip. And so they're sitting on a stagecoach, and there's a gentleman sitting across from them. And it's not polite to talk to people when you're traveling that you don't know. So she and her brother are conversing in Spanish, and Octavia could speak 5 languages. And this gentleman across the way said, and then she's talked about a bullfight in Spain. And this gentleman across the way interjected and said, and so won that bullfight. And then Octavia said, then you must be Washington Irving. And he said, how did you know that? And she said, the man sitting next to you told me that story. So the Waltons were very connected. They were very, you might think of it just rural here, but they traveled, they conversed, they wrote letters to all the important people of the day that were doing things. So that's how that story happened in 1833. And I'm going to digress. 1827, Octavia and her mother took another trip to get away somewhat of the gossip in Pensacola that was happening with her father. So they took another trip and up to Boston. And that's where she met Edgar Allan Poe. And that's when he wrote a poem for her, Octavia. And you'll find it in the Poe books of when wit and wine and friends have met and laughter crowns the festive hour, in vain I struggle to forget, but still my heart throbs for thee. You know, so it's a great poem. It's a short little poem. It's in his books. And so Octavia, I think, was on the wrong side of the war. After what happened is in 1833, they'd kind of had it, their time here in Florida. Dorothy Walton, the signer's wife, had died and left them some money. So they moved to Mobile. And I think that's where we kind of maybe lost some of that information about the Walton, especially Octavia. But she lived there in Mobile. And that's where I found the picture of George Walton Jr. It's the Oakley House. If you want to go to the Oakley House in Mobile, in the historic district, it has the picture of George Walton Jr., a couple of Octavia, Sarah Walton, but there's no known picture of Dorothy Walton to this date. One or two publications erroneously say that it's her, but it's not. So we don't have a picture of Dorothy Walton, the signer. But that's, with her dying and giving all her slaves, they had a number of slaves, and George Walton had a number of slaves in Tallahassee. He's listed, I think, in the 28 census, that he had at least 12 to 18 slaves there in Tallahassee, because he ended up living there, sort of estranged from the family. When they moved to Mobile, he was immediately almost elected mayor of Mobile. And so I went there to the archives, and they have a lot of his papers and where he signed them. So that's his signature that I took a picture of. So South Walton has done several books that people could look at. So try to catch up on some of the South Walton history. There's a lot of people, my family, the Andersons, my dad, Mac Anderson, who, that's how I knew Sonny Yates so well, is my dad had coached him, and he had been friends with the Yates family. And Sonny went out to Texas and was at Rice University, and we had moved out there for Dad to coach out there. So that's how I first met Sonny, and we had our connections there. But the Andersons came early on in those early 1800s in Alaqua. Now they lost a lot of their land with World War II in the Eglin. They were one of the ones there in the Alaqua area that lost a lot of their land. But my dad knew a lot of the Wesleys. Gene Wesley. The Wesleys, they were here on Eastern Lake, had this property, had the Wesley House built in 1897 there at Point Washington, which is now Eden State Gardens, a state park. You can go there. Jackson didn't like Florida. He only stayed here 4 months in 1820. And so what happened, he named George Walton Jr. the acting governor of West Florida, and another gentleman, the acting governor of East Florida. But George Walton had made some amendment. He told that other governor to run the papers through Walton up to him, as he had gone back to Hermitage to run for president. And he beat Henry Clay during that time. So we ended up with Jackson as president. That was in 1833. And I think that's one reason, again, that the Waltons left. And another reason that Henry Marie Brackenridge left, because he was judge of West Florida, he got in somewhat of, I think, the crosshairs with Jackson, and so he went back to Philadelphia and continued running for Congress and living his life out there. So I think that's, again, why we lost about Brackenridge, even though he had 500 plus acres, had the first courthouse, and he was, I think, the main author for the Monroe Doctrine. So here's a really significant American person that lived in Walton County that most people have never heard of and don't know about. So really, really important there. Eastern Lake here, we could go out. There's a little cabin still on the lake that Mickey Wesley, who was the 9th and youngest child of William Wesley, who was the 9th son of John Wesley, not the John Wesley. He started the Methodist Church. He was the first and fourth pastor there at the Point Washington Methodist Church. We had 9 sons. One was William Wesley, and it was William Wesley in 1903 that got a 160-acre land grant here on Eastern Lake, and this is where they came to the beach. Not Grayton. It was in Sandpiper, a journal written by Peggy Baylor, kind of talks about the people from Point Washington really came to Eastern Lake here to the beach, and you can see still some of those old sand roads and trails through Point Washington State Forest at that point. It's wonderful that Eastern Lake is here and has the Point Washington State Forest on the north end, so that keeps some wildness about the area. As far as me, the Andersons, but my family was the Jacksons, and this is the Jackson Motel that Lynn Hollingsworth, Sonny's daughter-in-law, she painted. This is a print of the original. It's got some really neat, unique things in it. But the Jackson Motel is now where the Liberty Fire Station is. And when I was in 2nd grade, I think I lived in that cabin there. So the bus would pick us up. And so this is the Jackson Motel that's no longer there, but one of the older historic motels there on Highway 90. L.I. Smith from Missouri and South Dakota. They actually came to Walton County for a Chautauqua, I believe, in 1899. He and P.W. Smith. They used initials back then. A lot of people used initials. But they came and they moved permanently to Walton County in Florida in 1903, and they're really attracted by the Chautauqua is what attracted them. And one thing says he's a doctor. No, he was a banker and a developer. His next door neighbor was his brother-in-law, Dr. Dye. He was a doctor, and he had a photo lab in his basement, one of the few basements around Defuniak. And his niece was Anna Smith Hollingsworth Reardon, who was a longtime reporter for the Defuniak Herald, and I have all her pictures and papers. And so this is a picture of Anna Smith and L.I. Smith and her sister Billy back in the day. This is her dad, P.W. Smith here. And L.I. Smith also in around 1906, built the Gulf View Hotel, which is now I think the Chamber of Commerce maybe, office there on Highway 90. Well, L.I. Smith was the one that built the Gulf View Hotel. Remember 1906, that little border? It was, Camp Walton then. And these postcards have this has a Defuniak Springs address. I have one that has someone in my collection that has a Camp Walton. These are from Mr. Buck that everyone knows about. These are the original postcards that are in Anna's collections to Mr. Ralph Buck. Dear Ralph, I send you greetings, and it's postmarked. And then this is to Miss Mabel Buck. So what happens, L.I. Smith built the Gulf View Hotel in 1906, and he sold it around 1913 to the Staffs and Gerlachs. That's who everybody knows about, but it was L.I. Smith of Walton County, Circle Drive there in Defuniak, that owned it. And besides owning this, he owned a lot of other things, including Wiscasset. This is Wiscasset there on 331, right next to the Sonic. This was the Smith Dairy. It was the longest acting dairy probably in Florida at one time, from around 1906 to 1945. And would be just a fabulous historical welcome center, in my opinion, or some kind of wonderful bed and breakfast, because has a lot of repairs it needs now, but it is one of the more historical houses in Walton County. What else did L.I. Smith and the family own? If you go to Dew Lakes Elementary and you see this, look, the Anna, this was named after Anna Smith, the niece, and also L.I. Smith's wife was Anna Dorinda Smith. And so he had this boat built in 1910 to take his family from Defuniak down to their properties here at the beach, and this is what they used. And one of his guests, it was often written up in the paper, that McLean, they were guests. All these Defuniak people would come, and they would come across the bay and on this boat here. In 1824, the people know the Smith House. And this was owned by Kenneth Tuff Smith and Eileen Smith. And Eileen Smith, of course, was Sonny Hollingsworth, my stepdad's, that was his aunt. And they kind of raised him as a son because his dad had been killed in a dairy accident when he was just a little boy. So Tuff Smith, the known Pompano fisherman of Grayton Beach, this is his house. And it's across, at that point, and Sonny called it, I've got a picture of Sonny and Van Ness and his cousin, Thornburg, across in the Smith front yard, across from the White Elephant, which people now know as the Red Bar. So they called it, Sonny, he has passed now, but so they called it the White Elephant, and then it was the Grayton store, and now it's the famous Red Bar. So it was just across the street from the Smith house. Anna Smith lived more up in Defuniak, and she went to Palmer College, and this is an original 1922. This is her yearbook. This is her yearbook from 1922 from Palmer, where Palmer College was, and this is the Palmer College, the seniors, so it had the high school too. So there's Anna down there, but you'll see the names. You can see familiar names there that she wrote in, the McCaskells and the Campbells, and these were her classmates. So these were very connected people, and she has their letters, and she has like this book here. I mean, they were so connected. There's one guy, Walter, his dad was I think the Italian consulate, and he came down to the beach with them. So they're very connected. Because of the Florida Chautauqua, it really attracted people interested in education, the arts and culture, and they were interested in vacationing. So they came, L.I. Smith had, his hotels and houses down here, as Defuniak had theirs, and people came by the thousands, on the railroads. But then they could also then come down here to the beach, and so we've long been a vacation place. Here's that early map that shows Alaqua was really the roads leading to Alaqua, George Walton, Jackson. Of course, Octavia named Tallahassee, and y'all would have seen just this week in the paper, Tallahassee is also 200 years old, and so they just had their 200th, and they built a replica log cabin of the first Capitol, and so that was a great celebration. But Octavia is known to have actually named Tallahassee because she was friends with Neamafa, one of the early, he was a leader at that time and signed a lot of the official papers, but she could speak the different languages, and she was a friend of him, and the native people called her the White Dove of Peace. So that's how that makes sense. Washington Irving, with Octavia being friends, a lot of their letters survive, and he was also the U.S. Commissioner of Indian Affairs in 1832. The McGilvery Monument in Pensacola. That's about how some of our land grants get complicated, is because Alexander McGilvery, this monument in Pensacola, he worked for everyone. He was half Creek, half American, but he worked for the British and the Americans, and so that's an interesting monument. He's not buried there anymore. They moved him to Alabama. There's that early little map of Florida. This shows Henry Clay was again ended up being one of Octavia's good friends for her lifetime. He ran unsuccessfully 3 times for president, but they were good friends, and she in fact named one of her daughters after them. She went to the Methodist Church there in Pensacola, and she was Episcopal, but she was so bright when she was 10, and Reverend Alexander Talley, who was the first Methodist minister assigned to Florida after it became a territory, and he was assigned to Pensacola, he wrote about her in his papers. This is the Walton house. This is where the Waltons lived in Pensacola, and so I'm dressed up as Octavia there. I was speaking to some group there. This is the Patton and Leslie house, a small little replica of it, and that is besides all the merchandising that went on, that's how maybe some of the native peoples had land, and they lost their land through different bills or means. And then that's a picture of Washington Irving that Octavia met in 1833 and were lifetime friends. early map. That's the Norvez. Have spoken. This is on Brackenridge's land there in Alaqua. So, and then of course George Walton's signature, George Walton Jr. Of course, George Walton, the signer, has his signature on the Declaration of Independence, but that's the signature is fairly similar, I think, if you look at both of them. So that sort of is